Greetings, malicious readers. Welcome back to Disenthrall. That's another Let's Read. As you know, our Let's Read series are unlike the Think Time series on the Disenthrall 2 Think Time channel, where on those, I don't participate in the comments. On these, I do. You guys are welcome to hang out with me. We're going to be here for 2 to 3 hours reading Michael Malice's book, The Anarchist Handbook. And let's see, what else should I forgot to mention last time, the beautiful background that you see on this video, including the Anarchist Handbook cover, is available as a exclusive supporter reward and thank you for the people that support the channel. If you'd like to have that background as an animated wallpaper for your computer, you can get that if you become a supporter at disenthrall.me/support. So big shout out and thank you to our supporters. Enjoy the wallpaper. That and many other wallpapers. There's quite a collection that has grown now. All right, so we're going to get started with, well, chapter 6 and 7 are communess, yay. And then if we have time, hopefully we will, we'll get to the following chapter by Spooner. So, yeah, let's get started with chapter 6. This chapter is by Josiah Warren from A True Civilization and Immediate Necessity and the Last Ground of Hope for Mankind, written in 1863. This is Michael Malice's introductory paragraph. America in the 19th century was a truly odd place, with many varied social experiments occurring throughout the vast, quickly growing nation. Among them was Joseph Warren's utopian community. Modern times on New York's Long Island. Warren took the labor theory of value seriously and advocated for an economics under his slogan of, quote, cost the limit of price, end quote. He decreed the price of an item should not be set by the market, but by how much work went into producing it, and even issued currency based on hours worked to his followers. As America was ripping itself in half, brother slaughtering brother in the Civil War, Warren was denouncing the state's authority in his book, True Civilization. Government and its true function. Now we're going to actually begin the article by Josiah Warren. Number 1. With all due deference to other judgments, I venture to assert that our present deplorable condition, like that of many other parts of the world, is in consequence of the people in general never having perceived or else having lost sight of the legitimate object of all governments as displayed or implied in the American, quote, Declaration of Independence. 2. Every individual of mankind has an, quote, inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it is solely to protect and secure the enjoyment of these rights unmolested that governments can properly be instituted among men, end quote. In other terms, self-sovereignty is an instinct of every living organism, and it being an instinct cannot be alienated or separated from that organism. It is the instinct of self-preservation. The votes of 10,000 men cannot alienate it from a single individual, nor could the bayonets of 20,000 men neutralize it in any one person, any more than they could put a stop to the instinctive desire for food in a hungry man. 3. The action of this instinct being involuntary, every one has the same absolute right to its exercise that he has to his complexion or the forms of his features, to any extent not disturbing another, and it is solely to prevent or restrain such disturbances or encroachments that governments are properly instituted. In still shorter terms, the legitimate and appropriate mission of governments is the defense and protection of the inalienable right of sovereignty in every individual within his or her own sphere. But what is it that constitutes encroachment? Number 4. Suppose my house to be on fire, and I seize a pail of water in the hands of a passerby without waiting to explain or ask leave. This would be one degree of encroachment, but perhaps the owner would excuse it on the ground of its necessity. Suppose a man walks into my house without waiting for leave. It may or may not disturb or offend me or constitute a degree of encroachment. If I find that he has no excusable errand and require him to retire and he refuses, this would be a degree of encroachment, which I might meet with a few words and might need no government to assist me. If he proceeds to rob the house, I may have reason to think that he is driven to desperation by having a starving family, and I may not resort to violence. Or I may perceive that he is a wanton and reckless robber or filibuster, and that this is an unnecessary encroachment, which, in defense of my own rights, as well as the same rights in others, I am justifiable in resisting. And if I have not sufficient power to do so without endangering myself or property, I will call for help. This help, whether in the form of police or an army, is government, and its function is to use force, to prevent him from using force against me and mine. It interferes with my consent to prevent interference with my sovereign right to control my own. Its mission is, quote, intervention for the sake of non-intervention. Number 5. If he has already got possession of my purse, I should want him... excuse me. Woo. There we go. Got it worked out. Sorry about that. I should want him to be compelled, without any unnecessary violence, to give it up, and perhaps to compensate the police. And till I had learned better, I might have approved of his being confined in prison till he had done this, and compensated me for being disturbed. But there are objections to proceeding to these complicated measures. There is no principle generally known by which to determine what constitutes compensation. He could not get properly compensated for his work, which might be a greater injustice to him than he had done to me, and it would inflict on his innocent father, mother, brothers, and sisters, his wife and children, and all his friends incalculable injustice and suffering, and this would be no compensation to me. Besides, I, as a citizen of the same world, am a partner in the crime by not having prevented the temptation to it. What? So, I believe, if I interpret that paragraph correctly, that you imprisoning somebody until they return your property could be unjust because the compensation that they would be missing by being in prison might be worth more than what they stole from you? Well, that doesn't follow even a little. Number 6. With all these considerations against pursuing him farther, I think it the best present expedient to put up with the restoration of my purse, as he gains nothing to tempt the continuance of the business. The word expedient may look loose and unsatisfactory, but among all the works of mankind there is nothing higher than expedience. Number 7. The instinct of self-preservation or self-sovereignty is not the work of man, but to keep it constantly in mind as a sacred right in all human intercourse is highly expedient. Number 8. Perceiving that we can invent nothing higher than expedience, we necessarily set aside all imperative or absolute authorities, all sanguinary and unbending codes, creeds, and theories, and leave everyone free to choose among expedients, or, in other words, we place all action upon the voluntary basis. Do not be alarmed, we shall see this to be the highest expedient whenever it is possible. Number 9. It is only when the voluntary is wantonly encroached upon that the employment of force is expedient or justifiable. 10. It appears, however, that no rule or law can be laid down to determine beforehand what will constitute an offensive encroachment. What one will resist, another will excuse, and the subtle diversities of different persons and cases, growing out of the inherent individualities of each, have defied all attempts at perfect formalizing, except this of the sovereignty of every individual over his or her own. And even this must be violated in resisting its violation. What? It's not a violation to resist violation. Number 11. The legitimate sphere of every individual has never been publicly determined. But until it is clearly defined, we can never tell what constitutes encroachment, what may be safely excused, or what may be profitably resisted. 12. We will attempt then to define the sphere within which every individual may legitimately, rightly exercise supreme power or absolute authority. This sphere would include his or her person, time, property, and responsibilities. 13. By the word right is meant simply that which necessarily tends towards the end in view. The end in view here is permanent and universal peace and security of person and property. 14. I have said, in effect, that the present confusion and widespread violence and destruction results from a want of appreciation of this great right of individual sovereignty and its defense by government. 15. I now proceed to illustrate and prove this by considering what would be the natural consequences of bearing these two ideas all the time in mind as the regulators of political and moral movements, and holding them, as it were, as substitutes for all previous laws, customs, precedents, and theories. I think every single paragraph is numbered, and so I'm going to stop reading the numbers. I don't know why they're numbered. First, then, while admitting this right of sovereignty in everyone, I shall not be guilty of the ill manners of attempting to offensively enforce any of my theoretical speculations, which has been the common error of all governments. This itself would be an attempted encroachment that would justify resistance. The whole mission of coercive government, being the defense of persons and property against offensive encroachments, it must have force enough for the purpose. This force necessarily resolves itself into the military, for the advantages of drill and systematic cooperation, and this being perhaps the best form that government can assume. While a coercive force is needed, I make no issue with it, but only with the misapplications of its immense power. What's up, Helen, Coplock, NCAP, Fuckleberry, Noli, good to see you. Adhering closely to the idea of restraining violence as the mission of government or military power, if this sole purpose was instilled into the general mind as an element of education or discipline, no force could be raised to invade any persons or property whatever, and no defense would be necessary. If the Declaration of Independence, or this sacred right of individual sovereignty, had been commonly appreciated a year ago in the United States, they would not now be disunited. None of the destruction of persons and property which has blackened the past year would have occurred, nor would 1,200,000 citizens now be bent on destroying each other and their families and homes in these states. Every individual would have been, quote, free to entertain any theory of government whatever for himself or herself, and to test it by experiment within equitable limits. An issue would be raised only where this sacred right was denied, or against any who should have undertaken to enforce any theory of government whatever upon any individual against his or her, quote, consent. The frank and honest admission of this inalienable right would even now change the issue of this present war, and carry relief and protection to the invaded or oppressed, and war or resistance to the oppressor only, whether he were found on one side or the other of a geographical line. Mere theorists say that, quote, the laws of nations decide that a state of war between two nations puts all members of each in hostility to each other, end quote, and that, quote, the laws of nations justify us in doing all the harm we can to our enemies, end quote. We need no death warrant from authority against these barbarian theories. The very statement of them becomes their execution. 21. Every person being entitled to sovereignty within his own sphere, there can be consistently no limits or exceptions to the title to protection in the legitimate exercise of this sacred right, whether on this side or the other side of the Atlantic, and whether, quote, in a state of war or not. And as soon as we take position for this universal right for all the world, we shall have all the world for us and with us, and no enemies to contend with. Did military men ever think of this? Did governments ever think of it? 22. The whole proper business of government is the restraining offensive encroachments, or unnecessary violence to persons and property, or enforcing compensation therefor. But if, in the exercise of this power, we commit any unnecessary violence to any person whatever or to any property, we ourselves have become the aggressors and should be resisted. But who is to decide how much violence is necessary in any given case? We here arrive at the pivot upon which all power now turns for good or evil. This pivot under formal, exacting, aggressive institutions or constitutions is the person who decides as to their meaning. If one decides for all, then all but that one are perhaps enslaved. If each one's title to sovereignty is admitted, there will be different interpretations, and this freedom to differ will ensure emancipation, safety, repose, even in a political atmosphere. And all the cooperation we ought to expect will come from the coincidence of motives, according to the merits of each case as estimated by different minds. Where there is evidence of aggression palpable to all minds, all might cooperate to resist it. And where the case is not clearly made out, there will be more or less hesitation. Two great nations will not then be so very ready to jump at each other's throats when the most cunning lawyers are puzzled to decide which is wrong. Theorize as we may about the interpretation of the Constitution, every individual does unavoidably measure it and all other words by his own peculiar understanding or conceits, whether he understands himself or not, and should, like General Jackson, recognize the fact, quote, take the responsibility of it, and qualify himself to meet its consequences. The full appreciation of this simple but almost unknown fact will neutralize the war element in all verbal controversies, and the binding power of all indefinite words, and place conformity thereto on the voluntary basis. Did any institution makers, except the signers of the, quote, Declaration, ever think of this? It will be asked, what could be accomplished by a military organization if every subordinate were allowed to judge of the property of an order before he obeyed it? Let me try that again. It will be asked, what could be accomplished by a military organization if every subordinate were allowed to judge of the propriety of an order before he obeyed it? I answer that nothing could be accomplished that did not commend itself to men educated to understand, and trained to respect the rights of persons and property as set forth in the, quote, Declaration of Independence. And that here, and here only, will be found the long-needed check to the barbarian wantonness that lays towns in ashes, and desolates homes and hearts for brutal revenge, or to act office or a little vulgar newspaper notoriety. But what shall ensure propriety of judgment or uniformity or coincidence between the subordinates and the officers? I answer, drill, discipline, of mind as well as of arms and legs, teaching all to realize their true mission, the true object of all their power being clearly defined and made familiar. There would at once be a coincidence unknown before, but slight chance of dissent when there was good ground for cooperation. No subordination can be more perfect than that of an orchestra, but it is all voluntary. When we are ready to protect any person or property without regard to locality or party, there can be no hostile parties or nations, nothing to betray by treason, nothing to rebel against, no party to desert to. Then, whose fault is it that there are persons called traitors, rebels, and deserters? If it be true that the sole proper function of coercive force is to restrain or repair all unnecessary violence, then the conclusion is inevitable that all penal laws for punishing a crime or an act after it is committed, except so far as they work to compensate the injured party equitably, are themselves criminal. The excuse is that punishment is a terror to evildoers, but those who punish instead of preventing crime are themselves evildoers, and according to their own theory they should be punished and terrified. But the theory is false. Consistently carried out, it would depopulate the world. Such are the fogs in which we get astray when we trust ourselves away from first premises and substitute speculative theories in their stead. Had our military been properly educated to know its true function and purpose, Ellsworth would not have been shot for taking down a flag. The shooting of him did not restrain him, nor did the shooting of Mr. Jackson compensate Ellsworth. But it caused Mrs. Jackson to become insane with grief and has spread a hostile spirit to an incalculable extent among millions, which will descend to future generations, all of which originated in the denial to Mr. Jackson of his inalienable right to choose his own government, which the Declaration guarantees in explicit terms to everyone. 30. To take down Mr. Jackson's flag was one degree of encroachment, but it was not necessary to shoot Ellsworth for bad manners. Failing to educate him or to prevent him, one party was much in fault as the other, as much in fault as the other. The barbarian habit of shedding blood for irreparable offenses, quote, as a terror to evildoers, was acted upon in this case. Carried fully out, mutual slaughter would have continued till there would not be a man, woman, or child living upon the earth. Are not these statements perfectly in accordance with the Declaration of Independence, as well as with the teachings of the wisest and best of our species? I invite thought on the subject. I make the assertions not because they are implied in that declaration, but because they are just such as are demanded at this hour as the only possible means of salvation from barbarism. If the solutions herein presented should appear to require more steady manliness and consistent thought than such as commonly prevail, then instruction, drill, discipline are necessary for the minds as for the bodies of our military forces. But even in this discipline, the principal labor will consist in keeping the mind's eye steadily upon two ideas so simple as the right of sovereignty in every person and its judicious defense. Experience drifts us against all theories of combination to refer everything to individual decision and action, and we cannot therefore safely dispense with an ever-watchful discrimination and a strong self-government in every person in proportion to the magnitude of his or her sphere of action. Practical experience in this country in less than 1 year has driven us against the hopeful theory of democratic government, under the dreaded government of military despotisms, which is merely placing the deciding power in a few persons, and the persons and property of all the people at their disposal, while the Declaration of Independence and the instinct of self-preservation assert the absolute and inalienable right of everyone to control his own. Man-made powers are arrayed against nature's law. Here we have the fatal issue. What can be done? Are we again at the eve of a long night of desolation? Or is there some untried element in modern thought which can reconcile the seeming contradiction between instinct and experience? Can it be possible that one simple thought found in our own Charter of Rights, if introduced into military discipline, would solve not this great problem only, but others of even greater magnitude? A man cannot alienate his inalienable right of self-preservation or sovereignty by joining the military or any other combination. The assumption that this is possible has produced all our political confusion and violence, and will continue to produce just such fruits to the end of time, if the childish blunder is not exposed and corrected. Admitting this indestructible right of sovereignty in every individual at all times and in all conditions, one will not attempt to govern, but only guide or lead another. But we shall trust to principle or purpose for a general and voluntary coincidence and cooperation. Military officers will then become directors or leaders, not commanders. Obedience will be all the more prompt because it is rendered for an object, the greatest that can inspire human action. Resistance to all attempts at offensive and unnecessary governing or encroachments upon any persons or property whatsoever, as the great guarantee for the security of each and every individual. Then every man, woman, and child in the world is interested in acting for and with such a government. Our problem is theoretically solved, but its brightness dazzles us and its sublime magnitude bewilders. Let us take time. Having one man as general over thousands arises from the natural necessity for individuality in the directing mind when numbers wish to move together. But it does not necessarily imply any superiority of judgment or motive in the director of a movement beyond those of the subordinates. Any more shall the driver of an omnibus is presented to know the road better than the passengers. They may all know the road equally well, but if they all undertake to drive the horses, none of their purposes will be answered, and it would be equally ridiculous for the driver, under the plea of upholding subordination, to insist on carrying his passengers where they did not want to go, or refuse to let them get out when they wanted to secede. The necessity for the prompt execution of the directions of the one lead, or director, where numbers are acting together to obtain an object in view, is so self-evident, or can be so easily explained, that where there is a walls of this promptness, it implies that the fault is in having a bad cause, or unfit associates in a good one. The most intelligent people always make the best subordinates in a good cause, and in our modern military, it will require more true manhood to make a good subordinate than it will to be a leader. For the leader may very easily give orders, but they take the responsibility of that only, while the subordinate takes the responsibility of executing them. And it will require the greatest and highest degree of manhood, of self-government, presence of mind, and real heroism to discriminate on the instant and to stand up individually before all the core and future criticisms, and assume alone the responsibility of dissent or disobedience. His only support and strength would be in his consciousness of being more true to his professed mission than the order was, and in the assurance that he would be sustained by public opinion and sympathy as far as that mission was understood. Subordinates have many times refused to fire on their fellow citizens in obedience to the mere wantonness of authority, or of the ferocity of a crude discipline, and have thus, like William Tell, entitled themselves to the lasting gratitude and affection of generations. Men may lead and men must execute, but intelligence, principle, must regulate, and that principle must be the prevention or repair of all unnecessary violence or wanton disturbance of persons or property, if we are ever to have order or peace on earth. Even children, when drilled and trained with this idea, which is simply the true democratic idea, would become an ever-ready police to protect each other and the gardens, fruits, and other property around them, instead of being, as they often are, the imps of disturbance and destruction. The height of their ambition being to play Sogger and fight somebody or destroy something. This is our fault. The democratic idea, theoretically at the base of American institutions, has never been introduced into our military discipline, nor into our courts, nor into our laws, and only in a caricatured and distorted shape into our political system, our commerce, our education, and public opinion. Let this element be practically and consistently introduced, especially in the military department, and our country is saved. Otherwise, it is lost. When a high degree of intelligence, great manhood, self-government, close discrimination, real heroism, and gentle humanity are known to be necessary to membership in our military corps or government, these qualities will come into fashion and become the characteristics of the people. And to be thought destitute of them and unworthy of membership in the military would cause the greatest mortification, while to be known as a member in good standing would be an object sought as the highest honor. Well, that already didn't work. Man, if he could have seen the next 150 years, I wonder what he would have written differently, right? Is all this in exact and scientific accordance with our first premises in the Declaration of Independence? Or is it all a romantic dream? If we have been correct in our reasonings, then we have found the clue to the true mission and form of government, to the most perfect yet harmless subordination, the reconciliation of obedience with freedom, to the cessation of all hostilities between parties and nations, to universal cooperation for universal preservation and security of persons and property. We have found a government literally in the people, of the people, for the people. A government that is the people, for men, women, and children can take some direct or indirect part in it. A ready police or army adapted to all demands for either, a self-protecting party of the whole. A union not only on paper, but rooted in the heart, whose members, trained in the constant reverence for the inalienable right of sovereignty in every person, would be habituated to forbearance towards even wrong opinions and different educations and tastes, to patient endurance of irremediable injuries, and a self-governing deportment and gentleness of manner, and a prompt but careful resistance to wanton aggression wherever found, which would meet with a ready and an affectionate welcome in any part of the world. Every intelligent person would wish to be a member or to contribute in some manner to the great common cause. No coercive system of taxation could be necessary to such a government so simple that children will be first to comprehend it, and which even they can see it for their interests to assist, and then would as readily play Sagar to prevent mischief as to do mischief. With our mind's eye steadily fixed on this great democratic principle and object, let us immediately commence the agitation of the idea of forming companies of home guards on this principle. Let anyone who feels so disposed take the first steps and invite the cooperation of persons sufficiently intelligent to comprehend the object to form a nucleus. The known habitual regard to the inalienable rights of persons and property would be the best title to membership. Then, commence drill and discipline, keeping in mind all the time the kind of discipline required, which would be partly in the form of lectures, taking as texts the details of the destruction of persons and property going on all around us, and showing with how much less violence the same or better objects could have been accomplished, and in the drill giving some orders to do some unnecessary harm, on purpose to be disobeyed, in order to accustom the subordinates to, quote, look before they leap, or strike. Such a military force would be within, but not under discipline. In other words, its, quote, Sabbath would be made for man, not man for its Sabbath, end quote. To be under instead of within discipline is a mistake as fatal as that of getting under water instead of within water. If the true mission of the military, or enforcing power, is kept constantly in view, and made, as it were, the guiding star, scarcely anything can go seriously amiss, and in VC need no other guide for the use of a governing force, nor will it answer to allow any theories or precedents to override this one supreme consideration. Companies thus formed would do well to communicate with each other, which would be all the general organization required for a worldwide cooperation. Here would be a government to preserve and not to destroy, to protect and not to invade, a government that can include the whole strength of the world, when might would be for the right and no enemies to contend with. The charms of music, of mutual sympathy, the beauties of order, and of unity of dress and of movement in military displays, now so seductive to purposes of destruction and degradation, would entice to the highest and noblest objects of human ambition, which would never need a field of activity as long as wanton oppression, even of a single individual, has footing on earth. Thus far we have considered the true function of government, and find that it has to deal only with offensive encroachments upon persons or property, like a volunteer guard on a wrecked vessel in the confusion of disaster, the frenzy of... Okay, that's spelled H-L-U-N-G-E-R, but I think it's just misspelled. I think it means hunger, not hunger. The frenzy of hunger and the fear of starvation to prevent unnecessary destruction of life or property. An expedient choice of evils where there is nothing but evils to choose from. Society has thus far been only a series of failures, and is at this day a mere assemblage of wrecks thrown against each other on a tempestuous sea, without pilots, charts, rudders, or compass. Yeah, flunger. That's a word. The first ship has not yet been constructed that is not liable to be wrecked by the very element that moves it on a successful voyage. And the first form of general society is yet to be developed that would not be liable to destruction from the instinctive pursuit of happiness, without which no society would exist. Government, strictly and scientifically speaking, is a coercive force. A man, while governed with his own consent, is not governed at all. Deliberative bodies, such as legislatures, congresses, conventions, courts, etc., are not, scientifically speaking, are not government, which is simply coercive force. But, inasmuch as that force should never be employed without a deliberate reference to its legitimate object, and upon which all available wisdom should be brought to bear, a deliberative council, acting before or with the government, seems highly expedient if not indispensable. Moreover, there are subjects now before us, and continually arising, on which, by timely forethought, violent issues may be prevented from arising, and many most important subjects may be adjusted by counsel alone, without any appeal to force. Such counselors should not be tempted by unearned salaries and honors, nor by compensation measured by the necessities or weakness and defenselessness of their clients. Nor should they consist of those who, like editors of news, can make more money by wars and other calamities than they can by peace and general prosperity. But let the counselors be those who are willing to wait, like tillers of the soil, for compensation according to the quantity and quality of their work. Let compensation or honors come in the form of voluntary contributions after, but not before, benefits have been realized. It is therefore suggested that any person of either sex who may coincide with this proposition and who feels competent to give counsel in any department of human affairs publicly announce the fact, as lawyers and physicians now do, or permit their names and functions to be made accessible to the public in some manner, so that whoever may need honest counsel on any subject may know where to find it. If a meeting of such counselors is thought desirable by any interested party, he or she can invite such as are thought to be most competent for the occasion, according to the subject to be considered. These counselors, while in session, would constitute a deliberative assembly or advisory tribunal. It might consist of both sexes or either sex, according to the nature of the subject to be deliberated upon. After deliberation, or whenever any interested party feels ready to make up an opinion, let him or her write it down with the reasons for it, and present it to the counselors and the audience for their signatures, and let the document go forth to the public or to the interested parties. If there are several such documents, those having the signatures of counselors or persons most known to be reliable would have the most weight. But, in order to ensure any influence or benefit from either, let compensation come to the counselors like that to Rowland Hill, in voluntary contributions after the benefits of the opinions have to some extent been realized. After having thus brought the best experience and well-balanced counsels to bear upon any subject without satisfying all parties, every person has a sovereign right to differ from all the opinions of the tribunal while not invading or disturbing other persons or property. When an issue has already been raised, and no one of these decisions is acceptable to both parties, the decisions may be laid before the military or government to act at its discretion, selecting that course which promises the least violence or disturbance. If any member declines to act, his inalienable right to do so, being sacredly respected, would tend to confirm and illustrate the only principle that can regulate, at the very moment that it should regulate, the actions of others. To ensure the best order in such a deliberative assembly, no other subject than the one for which it is called should be introduced without unanimous consent, as each and every one has a sovereign right to appropriate his own time and to choose the subjects that shall occupy his attention, and a constant regard to the same right, fully appreciated by all, will suggest the careful avoidance of all unnecessary disturbance, which might prevent anyone from hearing whatever he or she prefers to listen to. This sentiment, becoming familiar to all as a monitor, but little disturbance would occur. When it did occur, the principle itself would immediately prompt its appreciators to stop it with as little violence as possible. Here again, we need no other regulator for the most perfect order than this great democratic principle. With such counselors ready to act, we should be immediately exempted from the necessity for any disagreeable personal disputations on subjects which so often lead to violence or lasting enmity between individuals and nations. All of the doubtful and unsettled can at once be referred to the highest tribunal with the assurance of obtaining the best decision that present attainments within our reach can furnish. A subject of great or universal interest may be laid before all such tribunals in the world, and their decisions brought to every city, village, and neighborhood, and to every door, and the relief from all disturbing controversies would be felt at every fireside. The sanction of such tribunals to any enterprise for public benefit would place its author or inventor fairly before the public for their patronage, instead of being left to starve for want of attention. While the absence or want of such sanction would put a sudden stop to the swarms of impostures and fallacies that now wear out the attention to no purpose, and render valueless the announcements of even valuable things, while with such a sanction the public might fool at advertisements with some prospect or benefit therefrom. This absolute right of sovereignty in every individual over his or her person, time, and property is the only rule or principle known to this writer that is not subject to exceptions and failures as a regulator of human intercourse. It is very often, however, impossible in our complicated entanglements for one or some to exercise this right without violating the same right in others. We will ask our counselors to examine disintegration as tile remedy. We will ask them what constitutes legitimate property. We will ask them for their least violent mode of securing land to the homeless and starving. Also, what would constitute the just reward of labor? We shall invite them to consider what ought to be the circulating medium or money. How it happens that the producers and makers of everything have comparatively nothing, and we shall ask them for some mode of adapting supplies to demands, for a better postal system, for a more equitable system of buying and selling, for a program of education in accordance with the democratic principle. And we will ask them, what will be the use of congresses, legislatures, and courts of law? These are some of the subjects that must immediately employ the best minds if the American experiment is not to prove a total failure. Not to say that the best minds have not been employed upon them, but that the required solutions were impossible without the aid of very recent, though very simple, developments. A conservatory and library will naturally spring up, where the records of the tribunal decisions and other contributions to public welfare will be preserved for reference and diffusion, and the world will begin to know its benefactors. This modern military as a government will be necessary only in the transitionary stage of society from confusion and wanton violence to true order and mature civilization. A rule by, I guess, the most intelligent. Not sure about that. When the simply wise shall sit in calm deliberation, patiently tracing out the complicated and entangled causes of avarice, of robberies, of murders, of wars, of poverty, of desperation, of suicides, of slaveries and fraud, violence and suffering of all kinds, and shall have found appropriate and practical means of preventing instead of punishing them, then the military will be the fitting messengers of relief and harbingers of security and of peace, of order and unspeakable benefits wherever their footsteps are found, and instead of being the desolators of the world, they will be hailed from far and near as the blessed benefactors of mankind. When these councils of wise men have solved all of the problems of the world. Oh, man. Those who may dissent from these views are, in that act, exercising the inalienable right, which has no exceptions, and they may perceive that they are thus assisting in the scientific inauguration of equitable freedom. In deference to pressing exigencies of the time, I have endeavored to put forth in the fewest possible words thoughts which seem to promise the relief required by all classes, parties, and nations, and have not dwelt upon existing errors and wrongs, they being sufficiently evident by contrast with tile right, any prolonged attack upon them is unnecessary. I have endeavored to show the sublime powers and dazzling beauties of an absolute principle of right, as a guiding star to our path, along with expedience entirely consistent therewith. If this search after the narrow path has become more fortunate than that of our predecessors, it is owing to circumstances so peculiar that they may be excused for being less successful. If we are self-deluded, with all our best energies devoted to general benefit, we shall need all the forbearance that we exercise toward them. It will be seen by some at least that each individual, assuming his or her share of the deciding power or government as proposed, the great American idea may be practically realized, and that the ever-disturbing problem of the, quote, balance of political power becomes solved, and security for person and property, the great proposed object of all governments, prospectively attained. If others see in this only the, quote, inauguration of anarchy, let no attempt be made to urge them into conformity, but let them freely and securely await the results of demonstration. Okay. Chapter 7. Strap on your hazmat suits. We're about to read Mikhail Bakunin. This is from The State and Marxism, 1867, and The God and the State from 1870. This is Michael's introduction paragraph. Contemporary right anarchists frequently proclaim that left anarchists are secret authoritarians, statists at heart. Historically, however, Marx's foremost ideological rival was Mikhail Bakunin. At the time, there was an enormous debate on the left as to whether communism should be achieved through the state, the Marxist position, or Bakunin's view that anarchism was the way. 50 years before the Soviet Union was founded, Bakunin was anticipating and denouncing what the theory of Marxism would mean in practice. All right, let's begin. All work to be performed in the employ and pay of the state. Such is the fundamental principle of authoritarian communism, of state socialism. The state having become sole proprietor at the end of a certain period of transition which will be necessary to let society pass without too great political and economic shocks from the present organization of bourgeois privilege to the future organization of the official equality of all. Keep in mind, this is one sentence. I'm doing my best here. The state will be also the only capitalist, banker, moneylender, organizer, director of all national labor, and distributor of its products. Whew. Such is the ideal, the fundamental principle of modern communism. enunciated for the first time by Babot, towards the close of the great French Revolution, with all the array of antique civism and revolutionary violence which constituted the character of the epoch. It was recast and reproduced in miniature about 45 years later by Louis Blanc in his tiny pamphlet, The Organization of Labor, in which that estimable citizen, much less revolutionary and much more indulgent towards bourgeois weaknesses than was Babot, tried to gild and sweeten the pill so that the bourgeois could swallow it without suspecting that they were taking a poison which would kill them. But the bourgeois were not deceived, and returning brutality for politeness, they expelled Louis Blanc from France. In spite of that, with a constancy which one must admire, he remained alone in faithfulness to his economic system, and continued to believe that the whole future was contained in his little pamphlet on the organization of labor. The communist idea later passed into more serious hands. Karl Marx, the undisputed chief of the Socialist Party in Germany, a great intellect armed with a profound knowledge, whose entire life, one can say it without flattering, has been devoted exclusively to the greatest cause which exists today, the emancipation of labor and of the toilers. Karl Marx, who is indisputably also, if not the only, at least one of the principal founders of the International Working Men's Association, made the development of the communist idea the object of a serious work. His great work, Capital, is not in the least a fantasy, an a priori conception, hatched out in a single day in the head of a young man more or less ignorant of economic conditions and of the actual system of production. It is founded on a very extensive, very detailed knowledge and a very profound analysis of this system and of its conditions. Karl Marx is a man of immense statistical and economic knowledge. His work on capital, though unfortunately bristling with formulas and metaphysical subtleties, which render it unapproachable for the great mass of readers, is in the highest degree a scientific or realist work, in the sense that it absolutely excludes any other logic than that of the facts. Living for very nearly 30 years, almost exclusively among German workers, refugees like himself, and surrounded by more or less intelligent friends and disciples, belonging by birth and relationship to the bourgeois world, Marx naturally has managed to form a communist school, or a sort of little communist church, composed of fervent adepts and spread all over Germany. This church, restricted though it may be on the score of numbers, is skillfully organized, and thanks to its numerous connections with working-class organizations in all the principal places in Germany, it has already become a power. Karl Marx naturally enjoys an almost supreme authority in this church, and to do him justice it must be admitted that he knows how to govern this little army of fanatical adherents in such a way as always to enhance his prestige and power over the imagination of the workers of Germany. Marx is not only a learned socialist, he is also a very clever politician and an ardent patriot. Like Bismarck, though by somewhat different means, and like many other of his compatriots, socialists or not, he wants the establishment of a great Germanic state for the glory of the German people, and for the happiness and the voluntary, or enforced, civilization of the world. The policy of Bismarck is that of the present. The policy of Marx, who considers himself at least his successor and his continuator, is that of the future. And when I say, is this whole freaking thing just going to be bragging about Marx? Okay. Now let us examine the particular character of Marx's policy. Let us ascertain the essential points on which it is to be separated from the Bismarckian policy. The principal point, and one might say the only one, is this. Marx is a Democrat, an authoritarian socialist, and a Republican. Bismarck is an out-and-out Pomeranian, aristocratic, monarchical junker. The difference is therefore very great, very serious, and both sides are sincere in this difference. On this point there is no possible understanding or reconciliation possible between Bismarck and Marx. Even apart from the numerous irrevocable pledges that Marx throughout his life has given to the cause of socialist democracy, His very position and his ambitions give a positive guarantee on this issue. In a monarchy, however liberal it might be, or even cannot be any place, any role for Marx, and so much the more so in the Prussian Germanic Empire founded by Bismarck with a bugbear of an emperor, militarist and bigoted as chief, and with all the barons and bureaucrats of Germany for guardians. Before he can arrive at power, Marx will have to sweep all that away. Therefore, he is forced to be revolutionary. That is what separates Marx from Bismarck. The form and conditions of government. One is an out-and-out aristocrat and monarchist, and in a conservative republic like that of France under Thiers, I don't know how to say that in French, Thiers. There the other is an out-and-out Democrat and Republican, and into the bargain a socialist Democrat and a socialist Republican. I'm scanning ahead to see if we're just going to keep talking about this. I'm losing interest quickly. If you guys want to read the full book, link in the description. I am not going to torture myself with nonsense. Let's see. Yeah, nothing amazing yet. Don't worry, I'm saving us all a lot of time. Hang in there. All right, let me just jump back in here and see what we find. Besides, the state, like the church by its very nature, is a great sacrificer of living beings. It is an arbitrary being, in whose heart all the positive living individual and local interests of the population meet, clash, destroy each other, become absorbed in that abstraction called the common interest, the public good, the public safety, and where all real wills cancel each other in that other abstraction which hears the name of the will of the people. It results from this, that this so-called will of the people is never anything else than the sacrifice and the negation of all the real wills of the population. Just as this so-called public school is nothing else than the sacrifice of their interests. But, so that this omnivorous abstraction could impose itself on millions of men, it must be represented and supported by some real being, by living force or other. Well, this being, this force, has always existed. In the church it is called the clergy, and in the state the ruling or governing class. And in fact, what do we find throughout history? The state has always been the patrimony of some privileged class or other. A priestly class, an aristocratic class, a bourgeois class, and finally, a bureaucratic class. When all the other classes, having become exhausted, the state falls or rises, as you will, to the condition of a machine. But it is absolutely necessary for the salvation of the state that there should be some privileged class or other which is interested in its existence. And it is precisely the united interest of this privileged class which is called patriotism. I'm skipping ahead just slightly, if we accept the fiction of a free state derived from a social contract, then discerning, just, prudent people ought not to have any longer any need of government or of state. Such a people can need only to live, leaving a free course to all their instincts. Justice and public order will naturally and of their accord proceed from the life of the people and the state, ceasing to be the providence, guide, educator, and regulator of society, renouncing all its repressive power and failing to the subaltern role which Proudhon assigns it, will no longer anything else but a simple business office, a sort of central clearinghouse at the service of society. Doubtless such a political organization, or rather, such a reduction of political action in favor of liberty and social life, would be a great benefit for society. But it would not at all please the devoted adherents of the state. They absolutely must have a state providence, a state directing social life, dispensing justice, and administering public order. That is to say, whether they admit it or not, and even when they call themselves Republicans, Democrats, or even Socialists, they always must have a people who are more or less ignorant, minor, incapable, or to call things by their right names, riff-raff, to govern. In order, of course, that doing violence to their own disinterestedness and modesty, they can keep the best places for themselves, in order always to have the opportunity to devote themselves to the common good, and that, strong in their virtuous devotion and their exclusive intelligence, privileged guardians of the human flock, whilst urging it on for its own good and leading it to security, they may also fleece it a little. Every logical and sincere theory of the state is essentially founded on the principle of authority. That is to say, on the eminently theological, metaphysical, and political idea that the masses, always incapable of governing themselves, must submit at all times to the benevolent yoke of a wisdom and a justice, which in one way or another is imposed on them from above. But imposed in the name of what, and by whom? Authority recognized and respected as such by the masses can have only three possible sources: force, religion, or the action of a superior intelligence. And this supreme intelligence is always represented by minorities. Slavery can change its form and its name. Its basis remains the same. This basis is expressed by the words: being a slave is being forced to work for other people. As being a master is to live on the labor of other people. In ancient times, as today, in Asia and Africa, slaves were simply called slaves. In the Middle Ages, they took the name of serfs. Today, they are called wage earners. The position of these latter is much more honorable and less hard than that of slaves, but they are none the less forced by hunger as well as by the political and social institutions to maintain by very hard work the absolute or relative idleness of others. Okay, so hunger is an experience that you get when you need subsistence. Experiences cannot act in the world and cannot force you. They cannot use force. They cannot coerce you into anything, much less accepting a job. This is the fundamental problem with commies. Anyway, consequently, they are slaves. And in general, no state, either ancient... If hunger makes you a slave, then we're all slaves to nature. So, feel free to rebel if you want. Good luck with that. And in general, no state, either ancient or modern, has ever been able or will be able to do without the forced labor of the masses, whether wage earners or slaves, as a principal and absolutely necessary basis of the liberty and culture of the political class, the citizens. Even the United States is no exception to this rule. Its marvelous prosperity and enviable progress are due in great part and above all to one important advantage: the great territorial wealth of North America, the immense quantity of uncultivated and fertile lands, together with a political liberty that exists nowhere else, attracts every year hundreds of thousands of energetic, industrious, and intelligent colonists. This wealth at the same time keeps off pauperism and delays the moment when the social question will have to be put. A worker who does not find work or who is dissatisfied with the wages offered by the capitalist can always, if need be, immigrate to the far west to clear there some wild and unoccupied land. This possibility, always remaining open as a last resort to all American workers, naturally keeps wages at a level and gives to every individual an independence unknown in Europe. Such is the advantage, but here is the disadvantage. As cheapness of the products of industry is achieved in great part by cheapness of labor, the American manufacturers, for most of the time, are not in a condition to compete against the manufacturers of Europe, from which there results for the industry of the northern states the necessity for a protectionist tariff. But that has a result, firstly, to create a host of artificial industries, and above all to oppress and ruin the non-manufacturing southern states and make them want secession. Finally, to crowd together into cities like New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and many others, proletarian working masses who, little by little, are beginning to find themselves already in a situation analogous to that of the workers in the great manufacturing states of Europe. And we see, in effect, the social question already being posed in the northern states, just as it was posed long before in our countries. And there, too, the self-government of the masses, in spite of all the display of the people's omnipotence, remains most of the time in a state of fiction. In reality, it is minorities which govern. The so-called Democratic Party, up to the time of the Civil War, to emancipate the slaves, were the out-and-out partisans of slavery, and of the ferocious oligarchy of the planters, demagogues without faith or conscience, capable of sacrificing everything to their greed and evil-minded ambition, and who, by their detestable influence and actions, exercised almost unhindered for nearly 50 years, continuously, have greatly contributed to deprave the political morality of North America. The Republican Party, though really intelligent and generous, is still and always a minority, and whatever the sincerity of this party of liberation, however great and generous the principles it professes, do not let us hope that, in power, it will renounce this exclusive position of a governing minority to merge into the mass of the nation, so that the self-government of the people shall finally become a reality. For that, there will be necessary a revolution far more profound than all those which hitherto have shaken the old and new worlds. Just skipping ahead a little bit. Choking, yeah, wasn't choking up like that. Developing phlegm. Commie phlegm. The masses, a man says to himself, recognizing their incapacity to govern on their own account, have elected me their chief. By that act they have publicly proclaimed their inferiority and my superiority. Among this crowd of men, recognizing hardly any equals of myself, I am alone capable of directing public affairs. The people have need of me, they cannot do without my services, while I, on the contrary, can get along all right by myself. They, therefore, must obey me for their own security, and in condescending to command them, I am doing them a good turn. End quote. Is not there something in all that to make a man lose his head and his heart as well, and become mad with pride? It is thus that power and the habit of command become, for even the most intelligent and virtuous men, a source of aberration, both intellectual and moral. But in the people's state of Marx, there will be, we are told, no privileged class at all. All will be equal, not only from the juridical and political point of view, but from the economic point of view. At least that is what's promised, though I doubt very much, considering the manner in which it is being tackled and the course it is desired to follow, whether that promise could ever be kept. There will therefore be no longer any privileged class, but there will be a government, and, note this well, an extremely complex government which will not content itself with governing and administering the masses politically, as all governments do today, but which will also administer them economically, concentrating in its own hands the production and the just division of wealth, the cultivation of land, the establishment and development of factories, the organization and direction of commerce, finally the application of capital to production by the only banker, the state. All that will demand an immense knowledge and many, quote, heads overflowing with brains in this government. It will be the reign of scientific intelligence, the most aristocratic, despotic, arrogant, and contemptuous of all regimes. There will be a new class, a new hierarchy of real and pretended scientists and scholars, and the world will be divided into a minority ruling in the name of knowledge and an immense ignorant majority. And then woe betide the mass of ignorant ones. Such a regime will not fail to arouse very considerable discontent in this mass, and in order to keep it in check, the enlightenment and liberating government of Marx will have need of a not less considerable armed force. For the government must be strong, says Engels, to maintain order among these millions of illiterates whose brutal uprising would be capable of destroying and overthrowing everything, even a government directed by heads overflowing with brains. You can see quite well that behind all the democratic and socialistic phrases and promises of Marx's program, there is to be found in his state all that constitutes the true despotic and brutal nature of all states. Whatever may be the form of their government, and that in the final reckoning, the people's state so strongly commended by Marx, and the aristocratic monarchic state maintained with as much cleverness as power by Bismarck, are completely identical by the nature of their objective at home as well as in foreign affairs. In foreign affairs it is the same deployment of military force, that is to say, conquest. And in home affairs it is the same employment of this armed force, the last argument of all threatened political powers against the masses, who, tired of believing, hoping, submitting, and obeying always, rise in revolt. Interesting to see a little bit of the infighting between commies and ancommies. All right, here's another section. What is authority? What is authority? Is it the inevitable power of the natural laws which manifest themselves in the necessary linking and succession of phenomena in the physical and social worlds? Indeed, against these laws, revolt is not only forbidden, it is even impossible. Needing to eat? We may misunderstand them or not know them at all, but we cannot disobey them, because they constitute the basis and the fundamental conditions of our existence. They envelop us, penetrate us, regulate all our movements, thoughts, and acts. Even when we believe that we disobey them, we only show their omnipotence. Yes, we are absolutely the slaves of these laws, but in such slavery there is no humiliation, or rather, it is not slavery at all. For slavery supposes an external master, a legislature outside of him whom he commands. While these laws are not outside of us, they are inherent in us. They constitute our being, our whole being, physically, intellectually, and morally. We live, we breathe, we act, we think, we wish only through these laws. Without them we are nothing. We are not. Whence then could we derive the power and the wish to rebel against them? In his relation to natural laws, but one liberty is possible to man, that of recognizing and applying them on an ever-extending scale of conformity with the object of collective and individual emancipation of humanization which he pursues. Skipping forward. Okay, he's just critiquing authority in a commie sort of way. Feel free, there's a link in the description if you want the book. We're finishing the chapter on Mikhail Bakunin. This is chapter 7. Okay, let me try and catch the conclusion of this chapter here. It is the characteristic of privilege and of every privileged position to kill the mind and heart of men. The privileged man, whether practically or economically, is a man depraved in mind and heart. That is a social law which admits of no exception, and is as applicable to entire nations as to classes, corporations, and individuals. It is the law of equality, the supreme condition of liberty and humanity. The principal object of this treatise is precisely to demonstrate this truth in all the manifestations of social life. A scientific body to which had been confided the government of society would soon end by devoting itself no longer to science at all, but to quite another affair, and that affair, as in the case of all established powers, would be its own eternal perpetuation, by rendering the society confided to its care ever more stupid and consequently more in need of its government and direction. But that which is true of scientific academies is also true of all constituent and legislative assemblies, even those chosen by universal suffrage. In the latter case they may renew their composition, it is true, but this does not prevent the formation in a few years of time of a body of politicians, privileged in fact though not in law, who, devoting themselves exclusively to the direction of the public affairs of a country, finally form a sort of political aristocracy or oligarchy. Witness the United States of America and Switzerland. Consequently, no external legislation and no authority, one for that matter being inseparable from the other, and both tending to the servitude of society and the degradation of the legislatures themselves, does it follow that I reject all authority? Oh, I think I ran that together, sorry. Does it follow that I reject all authority? Far from me such a thought. In the matter of boots, I refer to the authority of the bootmaker. Concerning houses, canals, or railroads, I consult that of the architect or the engineer. For such or such special knowledge, I apply to such or such a savant. Oh, for such or such. Okay, that's weird. I think we would say such and such. For such and such special knowledge, I apply to such and such a savant. But I allow neither the bootmaker nor the architect, nor savant, to impose his authority upon me. I listen to them freely, and with all the respect merited by their intelligence, their character, their knowledge, reserving always my incontestable right of criticism and censure. I do not content myself with consulting a single authority in any special branch. I consult several. I compare their opinions, and choose that which seems to me the soundest. But I recognize no infallible authority, even in special questions. Consequently, whatever respect I may have for the honesty and the sincerity of such and such individual, I have no absolute faith in any person. Such a faith would be fatal to my reason, to my liberty, and even to the success of my undertakings. It would immediately transform me into a stupid slave, an instrument of the will and interests of others. If I bow before the authority of the specialists and avow my readiness to follow to a certain extent, and as long as may seem to me necessary, their indications and even their directions, it is because their authority is imposed on me by no one, neither by men nor by God. This may be a misprint. Neither by men nor by God. Eons and even their directions? Guardians? No, I have no idea. This could just be a misprint. Otherwise I would repel them with horror, and bid the devil take their counsels, their directions, and their services, certain that they would make me pay by the loss of my liberty and self-respect for such scraps of truth wrapped in a multitude of lies as they might give me. I bow before the authority of special men because it is imposed on me by my own reason. I am conscious of my own inability to grasp in all its detail and positive development any very large portion of human knowledge. The greatest intelligence would not be equal to a comprehension of the whole. Thence results, for science as well as for industry, the necessity of the division and association of labor. I receive and I give, such is human life. Each directs and is directed in his turn. Therefore there is no fixed and constant authority, but continual exchange of mutual, temporary, and above all, voluntary authority and subordination. I don't know, sounds like voluntary hierarchy to me. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate this. This is what I always say. This is what I said when we were talking about like COVID and vaccines and all these controversies and stuff where the experts are cited as, listen to the experts. Okay, well, it's wise to take the counsel of experts, but at the end of the day, it's still you making the decision, as long as it's voluntary, You should listen to all the experts from all sides, and then take responsibility and make your own decision. That's what he's saying. So I agree with him there for sure. This same reason forbids me then to recognize a fixed, constant, and universal authority, because there is no universal man, no man capable of grasping in all that wealth of detail without which the application of science to life is impossible. All the sciences, all the branches of social life. And if such universality could ever be realized in a single man, and if he wished to take advantage thereof to impose his authority upon us, it would be necessary to drive this man out of society, because his authority would inevitably reduce all others to slavery and imbecility. I do not think that society ought to maltreat men of genius as it has done hitherto, but neither do I think it should indulge them too far, still less accord them any privileges or exclusive rights whatsoever. And that for 3 reasons. First, because it would often mistake a charlatan for a man of genius. Second, because through such a system of privileges it might transform into a charlatan, even a real man of genius, demoralize him and degrade him. And finally, because it would establish a master over itself. Okay. Ooh, boy, it's time. All right, I have to sip some tea. Chapter 8, Lysander Spooner, No Treason, Number 4, The Constitution of No Authority, 1870. It should be noted that I actually produced this as a formal, professional, high-quality audiobook, for those that aren't aware. You can find it on all of our uploaded platforms on Disenthrall. You can find it on YouTube, SoundCloud, Odysee, everywhere we upload. You can actually get this audiobook for free of the entire No Treason. So I'm assuming, let's see which one this is going to be. I mean, I'm happy to read this again. Woo! All right, let's get into it. This is the introduction by Malice. Abolitionist and attorney Lysander Spooner's essay, No Treason, consisted of 3 parts. It is the 3rd part, oddly numbered as 6, that holds the most sway today. The Constitution is like a no-guns zone sign. The Constitution is like a no-gun zone sign for conservatives, in that the only people it would bind are those who are already generally honest and peaceable. The ones who would lie or commit harm would simply look at the piece of paper and scoff. With unrelenting logic, Spooner dissects the sanctity of the Constitution and demonstrates that it cannot be said to have moral authority over anyone. Let's begin. Part 1. The Constitution has no inherent authority or obligation. It has no authority or obligation at all, unless as a contract between man and man. It does not so much as even purport to be a contract between persons now existing. It purports at most to be only a contract between persons living 80 years ago. And it can be supposed to have been a contract then only between persons who had already come to years of discretion so as to be competent to make reasonable and obligatory contracts. Furthermore, we know historically that only a small portion, even of the people then existing, were consulted on the subject, or asked, or permitted to express either their consent or dissent in any formal manner. Those persons, if any, who did give their consent formally, are all dead now. Most of them have been dead 40, 50, 60, or 70 years, and the Constitution, so far as it was their contract, died with them. They had no natural power or right to make it... Guys, this is the book I was reading when I had my moment of awakening from statist, sort of quasi-libertarian to anarchist. This is such good stuff. And the Constitution, so far as it was their contract, died with them. They had no natural power or right to make it obligatory upon their children. It is not only plainly impossible in the nature of things that they could bind their posterity, but they did not even attempt to bind them. That is to say, the instrument does not purport to be an agreement between anybody but, quote, the people then existing. Nor does it, either expressly or impliedly, assert any right, power, or disposition on their part to bind anybody but themselves. Let us see. Its language is, quote, "We, the people of the United States," that is, the people then existing in the United States, "in order to form a more perfect union, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." End quote. It is plain in the first place that this language, as an agreement, purports to be only what it at most really was, viz., a contract between the people then existing and, of necessity, binding as a contract only upon those then existing. In the second place, the language neither expresses nor implies that they had any intention or desire, not that they imagined they had any right or power, to bind their posterity to live under it. It does not say that their posterity will, shall, or must live under it. It only says, in effect, that their hopes and motives in adopting it were that it might prove useful to their posterity, as well as to themselves, by promoting their union, safety, tranquility, liberty, etc. Suppose an agreement were entered into in this form. We, the people of Boston, agree to maintain a fort on Governor's Island to protect ourselves and our posterity against invasion. This agreement, as an agreement, would clearly bind nobody but the people then existing. Secondly, it would assert no right, power, or disposition on their part to compel their posterity to maintain such a fort. It would only indicate that the supposed welfare of their posterity was one of the motives that induced the original parties to enter into the agreement. When a man says he is building a house for himself and his posterity, he does not mean to be understood as saying that he has any thought of binding them, nor is it to be inferred that he is so foolish as to imagine that he has any right or power to bind them, to live in it. So far as they are concerned, he only means to be understood as saying that his hopes and motives in building it are that they, or at least some of them, may find it for their happiness to live in it. So when a man says he is planting a tree for himself and his posterity, he does not mean to be understood as saying that he has any thought of compelling them, nor is it to be inferred that he is such a simpleton as to imagine that he has any right or power to compel them to eat the fruit. So far as they are concerned, he only means to say that his hopes and motives in planting the tree are that its fruit may be agreeable to them. So it was with those who originally adopted the Constitution, whatever may have been their personal intentions. The legal meaning of their language, so far as their posterity was concerned, simply was that their hopes and motives in entering into the agreement were that it might prove useful and acceptable to their posterity, that it might promote their union, safety, tranquility, and welfare, and that it might tend, quote, to secure to them the blessings of liberty. The language does not assert nor at all imply any right, power, or disposition on the part of the original parties to the agreement to compel their posterity to live under it. If they had intended to bind their posterity to live under it, they should have said that their object was not, quote, to secure to them the blessings of liberty, but to make slaves of them. For if their posterity are bound to live under it, they are nothing less than the slaves of their foolish, tyrannical, and dead grandfathers. Woo! Ha ha! It cannot be said that the Constitution formed, quote, the people of the United States for all time into a corporation. It does not speak of the people as a corporation, but as individuals. A corporation does not describe itself as, quote, we, nor as people, nor as ourselves. Nor does a corporation in legal language have any, quote, posterity. It supposes itself to have and speaks of itself as having perpetual existence as a single individuality. Moreover, no body of men existing at any one time have the power to create a perpetual corporation. A corporation can become practically perpetual only by the voluntary accession of new members as the old ones die off. But for this voluntary accession of new members, the corporation necessarily dies with the death of those who originally composed it. Legally speaking, therefore, there is in the Constitution nothing that professes or attempts to bind the posterity of those who established it. If, then, those who established the Constitution had no power to bind and did not attempt to bind their posterity, the question arises whether their posterity have bound themselves. If they have done so, they can have done so in only one or both of these two ways, viz., by voting and paying taxes. Part 2. Let us consider these two matters, voting and tax paying separately, and first of voting. All the voting that has ever taken place under the Constitution has been of such a kind that it not only did not pledge the whole people to support the Constitution, but it did not even pledge any one of them to do so, as the following considerations show. In the very nature of things, the act of voting could bind nobody but the actual voters. But owing to the property qualifications required, it is probable that, during the first 20 or 30 years under the Constitution, not more than 1/10, 15th, or perhaps 20th of the whole population, black and white, men, women, and minors, were permitted to vote. Consequently, so far as voting was concerned, not more than 1/10, 15th, or 20th of those then existing could have incurred any obligation to support the Constitution. At the present time, it is probable that not more than 1/6 of the whole population are permitted to vote. Consequently, so far as voting is concerned, the other 5/6 can have given no pledge that they will support the Constitution. 2. Of the 1/6 that are permitted to vote, probably not more than 2/3, about 1/9 of the whole population, have usually voted. Many never vote at all. Many vote only once in 2, 3, 5, or 10 years in periods of great excitement. No one by voting can be said to pledge himself for any longer period than that for which he votes. If, for example, I vote for an officer who is to hold office for only a year, I cannot be said to have thereby pledged myself to support the government beyond that term. Therefore, on the ground of actual voting, it probably cannot be said that more than 1/9 or 1/8 of the whole population are usually under any pledge to support the Constitution. Number 3. It cannot be said that, by voting, a man pledges himself to support the Constitution, unless the act of voting be a perfectly voluntary one on his part. Yet, the act of voting cannot properly be called a voluntary one on the part of any very large number of those who do vote. It is rather a measure of necessity imposed on them by others than one of their own choice. On this point I repeat what was said in a former number, viz., quote, "In truth, in the case of individuals, their actual voting is not to be taken as proof of consent, even for the time being. On the contrary, it is to be considered that, without his consent having ever been asked, a man finds himself environed by a government that he cannot resist. A government that forces him to pay money, render service, and forego the exercise of many of his natural rights, under peril of weighty punishments. He sees, too, that other men practice this tyranny over him by the use of the ballot. He sees further that if he will but use the ballot himself, he has some chance of relieving himself from this tyranny of others, by subjecting them to his own. In short, he finds himself, without his consent, so situated that if he use the ballot, he may become a master. If he does not use it, he must become a slave. And he has no other alternative than these two. In self-defense, he attempts the former. His case is analogous to that of a man who has been forced into battle, where he must either kill others or be killed himself. Because to save his own life in battle, a man attempts to take the lives of his opponents, it is not to be inferred that the battle is one of his own choosing. Neither in contests with the ballot, which is a mere substitute for a bullet, because as his only chance of self-preservation a man uses a ballot, is it to be inferred that the contest is one into which he voluntarily entered, that he voluntarily set up all his own natural rights as a stake against those of others to be lost or won by the mere power of numbers? On the contrary, it is to be considered that in an exigency into which he had been forced by others, and in which no other means of self-defense offered, he, as a matter of necessity, used the only one that was left to him. Doubtless the most miserable of men, under the most oppressive government in the world, if allowed the ballot, would use it, if they could see any chance of thereby ameliorating their condition. But it would not, therefore, be a legitimate inference that the government itself that crushes them was one which they had voluntarily set up, or even consented to. Therefore, a man's voting under the Constitution of the United States is not to be taken as evidence that he ever freely assented to the Constitution, even for the time being. Consequently, we have no proof that any very large portion, even of the actual voters of the United States, ever really and voluntarily consented to the Constitution, even for the time being. Nor can we ever have such proof until every man is left perfectly free to consent, or not, without thereby subjecting himself or his property to be disturbed or injured by others. I will take this moment to point out that this section on voting is the one point of disagreement where Spooner was wrong, and if you would like to see my arguments as to why voting is usually, not always, but usually immoral and non-justified, you can check out the article on disenthrall.me/voting. He uses a vote bullet as an analogy, like he's firing a bullet back at the people voting to control him. But in reality, most votes are more like vote grenades that not only explode injuring the people throwing vote grenades at you, but it also explodes injuring innocent people that are not voting to control you, which is not justifiable. Anyway, I digress. As we can have no legal knowledge as to who votes from choice and who from the necessity thus forced upon him, we can have no legal knowledge as to any particular individual that he voted from choice, or consequently that by voting he consented or pledged himself to support the government. Legally speaking, therefore, the act of voting utterly fails to pledge anyone to support the government. It utterly fails to prove that the government rests upon the voluntary support of anybody. On general principles of law and reason, it cannot be said that the government has any voluntary supporters at all, until it can be distinctly shown who its voluntary supporters are. Number 4. As taxation is made compulsory on all, whether they vote or not, a large proportion of those who vote no doubt do so to prevent their own money being used against themselves, when in fact they would have gladly abstained from voting, if they could thereby have saved themselves from taxation alone, to say nothing of being saved from all the other usurpations and tyrannies of the government. To take a man's property without his consent, and then to infer his consent because he attempts by voting to prevent that property from being used to his injury, is a very insufficient proof of his consent to support the Constitution. It is, in fact, no proof at all. And as we can have no legal knowledge as to who the particular individuals are, if there are any who are willing to be taxed for the sake of voting, we can have no legal knowledge that any particular individual consents to be taxed for the sake of voting, or, consequently, consents to support the Constitution. Number 5. At nearly all elections, votes are given for various candidates for the same office. Those who vote for the unsuccessful candidates cannot properly be said to have voted to sustain the Constitution. They may, with more reason, be supposed to have voted not to support they may, with more reason, be supposed to have voted not to support the Constitution, but specially to prevent the tyranny which they anticipate the successful candidate intends to practice upon them under color of the Constitution, and therefore may reasonably be supposed to have voted against the Constitution itself. This supposition is the more reasonable, inasmuch as voting is the only mode allowed to them of expressing their dissent to the Constitution. Many votes are usually given for candidates who have, number 6. Many votes are usually given for candidates who have no prospect of success. Those who give such votes may reasonably be supposed to have voted as they did with a special intention, not to support, but to obstruct the execution of the Constitution, and therefore against the Constitution itself. Number 7. As all the different votes are given secretly, by secret ballot, there is no legal means of knowing from the votes themselves who votes for and who against the Constitution. Therefore, voting affords no legal evidence that any particular individual supports the Constitution. And where there can be no legal evidence that any particular individual supports the Constitution, it cannot legally be said that anybody supports it. It is clearly impossible to have any legal proof of the intentions of large numbers of men, where there can be no legal proof of the intentions of any particular one of them. Number 8. There being no legal proof of any man's intentions in voting, we can only conjecture them. As a conjecture, it is probable that a very large proportion of those who vote do so on this principle, viz. That if, by voting, they could but get the government into their own hands or that of their friends, and use its powers against their opponents, they would then willingly support the Constitution. But if their opponents are to have the power and use it against them, then they would not willingly support the Constitution. In short, men's voluntary support of the Constitution is doubtless in most cases wholly contingent upon the question whether, by means of the Constitution, they can make themselves masters or are to be made slaves. Such contingent consent as that is in law and reason no consent at all. Number 9. As everybody who supports the Constitution by voting, if there are any such, does so secretly by secret ballot, and in a way to avoid all personal responsibility for the act of his agents or representatives, it cannot legally or reasonably be said that anybody at all supports the Constitution by voting. No man can reasonably or legally be said to do such a thing as to assent to or support the Constitution, unless he does it openly and in a way to make himself personally responsible for the acts of his agents, so long as they act within the limits of the power he delegates to them. Number 10. As all voting is secret by secret ballot, and as all secret governments are necessarily only secret bands of robbers, tyrants, and murderers, the general fact that our government is practically carried on by means of such voting only proves that there is among us a secret band of robbers, tyrants, and murderers, whose purpose is to rob, enslave, and, so far as necessary to accomplish their purposes, murder the rest of the people. The simple fact of the existence of such a band does nothing towards proving that, quote, the people of the United States, or any one of them, voluntarily supports the Constitution. For all the reasons that have now been given, voting furnishes no legal evidence as to who the particular individuals are, if there are any, who voluntarily support the Constitution. It therefore furnishes no legal evidence that anybody supports it voluntarily. So far, therefore, as voting is concerned, the Constitution, legally speaking, has no supporters at all. And, as a matter of fact, there is not the slightest probability that the Constitution has a single bona fide supporter in the country. That is to say, there is not the slightest probability that there is a single man in the country who both understands what the Constitution really is and sincerely supports it for what it really is. The ostensible supporters of the Constitution, like the ostensible supporters of most other governments, are made up of 3 classes, viz. Number 1, knaves, a numerous and active class who see in the government an instrument which they can use for their own aggrandizement or wealth. 2, dupes, a large class, no doubt, each of whom, because he has allowed one voice out of millions in deciding what he may do with his own person and his own property, and because he is permitted to have the same voice in robbing and murdering others that others have in robbing, enslaving, and murdering himself, is stupid enough to imagine that he is a, quote, free man, a sovereign, that this is a free government, a government of equal rights, the best government on earth, and such like absurdities. 3. A class who have some appreciation of the evils of government, but either do not see how to get rid of them, or do not choose to so far sacrifice their private interests as to give themselves seriously and earnestly to the work of making a change. Part 3. The payment of taxes, being compulsory, of course, furnishes no evidence that any one voluntarily supports the Constitution. Number 1. It is true that the theory of our Constitution is that all taxes are paid voluntarily, that our government is a mutual insurance company, voluntarily entered into by the people with each other, that each man makes a free and purely voluntary contract with all the others who are parties to the Constitution, to pay so much money for so much protection, the same as he does with any other insurance company, and that he is just as free not to be protected and not to pay a tax as he is to pay a tax and be protected. But this theory of our government is wholly different from the practical fact. The fact is that the government, like a highwayman, says to a man, "Your money or your life." And many, if not most, taxes are paid under the compulsion of that threat. The government does not indeed waylay a man in a lonely place, spring upon him from the roadside, and holding a pistol to his head proceed to rifle his pockets. But the robbery is none the less a robbery on that account, and it is far more dastardly and shameful. The highwayman takes solely upon himself the responsibility, danger, and crime of his own act. He does not pretend that he has any rightful claim to your money, or that he intends to use it for your own benefit. He does not pretend to be anything but a robber. He has not acquired impudence enough to profess to be merely a protector, and that he takes men's money against their will merely to enable him to protect those infatuated travelers who feel perfectly able to protect themselves, or do not appreciate his particular system of protection. He is too sensible a man to make such professions as these. Furthermore, having taken your money, he leaves you as you wish him to do so. He does not persist in following you on the road against your will, assuming to be your rightful sovereign on account of the protection he affords you. He does not keep protecting you by commanding you to bow down and serve him, by requiring you to do this and forbidding you to do that, by robbing you of more money as often as he finds it for his interest or pleasure to do so, and by branding you as a rebel, a traitor, and an enemy to your country, and shooting you down without mercy if you dispute his authority or resist his demands. He's too much of a gentleman to be guilty of such impostures and insults and villainies as these. In short, he does not, in addition to robbing you, attempt to make you either his dupe or his slave. The proceedings of those robbers and murderers who call themselves, quote, the government, are directly the opposite of the single highwaymen. In the first place, they do not, like him, make themselves individually known, or consequently take upon themselves personally the responsibility of their acts. On the contrary, they secretly, by secret ballot, designate some one of their number to commit the robbery in their behalf, while they keep themselves practically concealed. They say to the person thus designated, Go to this person, AB, and say to him that the government has need of money to meet the expenses of protecting him and his property. If he presumes to say that he has never contracted with us to protect him, and that he wants none of our protection, say to him that that is our business and not his, that we choose to protect him whether he desires us to or not, and that we demand pay, too, for protecting him. If he dares to inquire who the individuals are who have thus taken upon themselves the title of the government, and who assume to protect him and demand payment of him without his having ever made any contract with them, say to him that that, too, is our business and not his, that we do not choose to make ourselves individually known to him, that we have secretly, by secret ballot, appointed you our agent to give him notice of our demands, and, if he complies with them, to give him in our name a receipt that will protect him against any similar demand for the present year. If he refuses to comply, seize and sell enough of his property to pay not only our demands, but all your own expenses and trouble beside. If he resists the seizure of his property, call upon the bystanders to help you. Doubtless some of them will prove to be members of our band. If, in defending his property, he should kill any of our band who are assisting you, capture him at all hazards, charge him in one of our courts with murder, convict him and hang him. If he should call upon his neighbors, or any others who, like him, may be disposed to resist our demands, and they should come in large numbers to his assistance, cry out that they are all rebels and traitors, that, quote, our country is in danger. Call upon the commander of our hired murderers. Tell him to quell the rebellion and, quote, save the country, cost what it may. Tell him to kill all who resist, though they should be hundreds of thousands, and thus strike terror into all others similarly disposed. See that the work of murder is thoroughly done, that we may have no further trouble of this kind hereafter. When these traitors shall have thus been taught our strength and our determination, they will be good, loyal citizens for many years, and pay their taxes without a why or a wherefore. It is under such compulsion as this that taxes, so called, are paid, and how much proof the payment of taxes affords that the people consent to support, quote, the government, it needs no further argument to show. Number 2. Still, another reason why the payment of taxes implies no consent or pledge to support the government is that the taxpayer does not know, and has no means of knowing, who the particular individuals are who compose, quote, the government. To him, the government is a myth, an abstraction, an incorporeality, with which he can make no contract, and to which he can give no consent and make no pledge. He knows it only through its pretended agents. The government itself he never sees. He knows indeed by common report that certain persons of a certain age are permitted to vote, and thus to make themselves parts of, or if they choose, opponents of the government, for the time being. But who of them do thus vote? And especially how each one votes, whether so as to aid or oppose the government, he does not know, the voting being all done secretly by secret ballot. Who therefore practically compose the government? For the time being, he has no means of knowing. Of course, he can make no contract with them, give them no consent, and make them no pledge. Of necessity, therefore, his paying taxes to them implies on his part no contract, consent, or pledge to support them. That is, to support the government, or the Constitution. Number 3. Not knowing who the particular individuals are who call themselves, quote, the government, the taxpayer does not know whom he pays his taxes to. All he knows is that a man comes to him representing himself to be the agent of the government. That is, the agent of a secret band of robbers and murderers who have taken to themselves the title of the government and have determined to kill everybody who refuses to give them whatever money they demand. To save his life, he gives up his money to the agent. But, as this agent does not make his principles individually known to the taxpayer, the latter, after he has given up his money, knows no more who are the government, that is, who were the robbers, than he did before. To say, therefore, that by giving up his money to their agent, he entered into a voluntary contract with them, that he pledges himself to obey them, to support them, and to give them whatever money they should demand of him in the future, is simply ridiculous. Number 4. All political power, as it is called, rests practically upon this matter of money. Any number of scoundrels having money enough to start with can establish themselves as a government, because, with money, they can hire soldiers, and with soldiers extort more money, and also compel general obedience to their will. It is with government, as Caesar said it was in war, that money and soldiers mutually supported each other, that with money he could hire soldiers, and with soldiers extort money. So, these villains who call themselves governments well understand that their power rests primarily upon money. With money they can hire soldiers, and with soldiers extort money. And when their authority is denied, the first use they always make of money is to hire soldiers to kill or subdue all who refuse them more money. For this reason, whoever desires liberty should understand these vital facts, viz. 1. That every man who puts money into the hands of a government, so called, puts into its hands a sword which will be used against himself, to extort more money from him, and also to keep him in subjection to its arbitrary will. 2. That those who will take his money without his consent in the first place will use it for his further robbery and enslavement, if he presumes to resist their demands in the future. 3. That it is a perfect absurdity to suppose that any body of men would ever take a man's money without his consent, for any such object as they profess to take it for, viz. That of protecting him. For why should they wish to protect him if he does not wish them to do so? To suppose that they would do so is just as absurd as it would be to suppose that they would take his money without his consent for the purpose of buying food or clothing for him when he did not want it. 4. If a man wants protection, he is competent to make his own bargains for it, and nobody has any occasion to rob him in order to protect him against his will. 5. That the only security men can have for their political liberty consists in their keeping their money in their own pockets until they have assurances perfectly satisfactory to themselves that it will be used as they wish it to be used, for their benefit and not for their injury. 6. That no government so called can reasonably be trusted for a moment, or reasonably be supposed to have honest purposes in view any longer than it depends wholly upon voluntary support. These facts are all so vital and so self-evident that it cannot reasonably be supposed that anyone will voluntarily pay money to a government for the purpose of securing its protection, unless he first makes an explicit and purely voluntary contract with it for that purpose. It is perfectly evident, therefore, that neither such voting nor such payment of taxes actually take place proves anybody's consent or obligation to support the Constitution. Consequently, we have no evidence at all that the Constitution is binding upon anybody, or that anybody is under any contract or obligation whatever to support it. And nobody is under any obligation to support it. Whew! Oh, it's good. It's so good. We're hitting the 2-hour mark on the stream, and I don't care. There's a lot left, and I'm going to try and do it. I'm going to do it. Let's do it. Part 4. The Constitution not only binds nobody now, but it never did bind anybody. It never bound anybody, because it was never agreed to by anybody in such a manner as to make it on general principles of law and reason binding upon him. It is a general principle of law and reason that a written instrument binds no one until he has signed it. This principle is so inflexible a one that even though a man is unable to write his name, he must still, quote, make his mark before he is bound by a written contract. This custom was established ages ago when few men could write their names, when a clerk, that is, a man who could write, was so rare and valuable a person that even if he were guilty of high crimes, he was entitled to pardon on the ground that the public could not afford to lose his services. Even at that time, a written contract must be signed, and men who could not write either made their mark or signed their contracts by stamping their seals upon wax affixed to the parchment on which their contracts were written. Hence the custom of affixing seals that has continued to this time. The law holds and reason declares that if a written instrument is not signed, the presumption must be that the party to be bound by it did not choose to sign it, or to bind himself by it, and law and reason both give him until the last moment in which to decide whether he will sign it or not. Neither law nor reason requires or expects a man to agree to an instrument until it is written. For until it is written, he cannot know its precise legal meaning. And when it is written, he has had the opportunity to satisfy himself of its precise legal meaning. He is then expected to decide, and not before, whether he will agree to it or not. And if he does not then sign it, his reason is supposed to be that he does not choose to enter in such a contract. The fact that the instrument was written for him to sign, or with the hope that he would sign it, goes for nothing. Where would be the end of fraud and litigation if one party could bring into court a written instrument without any signature and claim to have it enforced upon the ground that it was written for another man to sign? That this other man had promised to sign it? That he ought to have signed it? That he had the opportunity to sign it if he would, but that he had refused or neglected to do so? Yet, that is the most that could ever be said of the Constitution. The very judges who profess to derive all their authority from the Constitution, from an instrument that nobody ever signed, would spurn any other instrument not signed that should be brought before them for adjudication. Moreover, a written instrument must, in law and reason, not only be signed, but must also be delivered to the party, or to someone for him, in whose favor it is made, before it can bind the party making it. The signing is of no effect unless the instrument be also delivered, and a party is at perfect liberty to refuse to deliver a written instrument after he has signed it. He is as free to refuse to deliver it as he is to refuse to sign it. The Constitution was not only never signed by anybody, but it was never delivered by anybody, or to anybody's agent or attorney. It can therefore be of no more validity as a contract than can any other instrument that was never signed or delivered. As further evidence of the general sense of mankind as to the practical necessity there is that all men's important contracts, especially those of a permanent nature, should be both written and signed, the following facts are pertinent. For nearly 200 years, that is, since 1677, there has been on the statute book of England, and the same in substance, if not precisely in letter, has been reenacted and is now in force in nearly or quite all states of this Union, a statute, the general object of which is to declare that no action shall be brought to enforce contracts of the more important class unless they are put in writing and signed by the parties to be held chargeable upon them. The principle of the statute, be it observed, is not merely that written contracts shall be signed, but also that all contracts, except those specifically exempted, generally those that are for small amounts and are to remain in force but for a short time, shall be both written and signed. The reason of the statute on this point is that it is now so easy a thing for men to put their contracts in writing and sign them, and their failure to do so opens the door to so much doubt, fraud, and litigation, that men who neglect to have their contracts of any considerable importance written and signed ought not to have the benefit of the courts of justice to enforce them. As this reason is a wise one, and that experience has confirmed its wisdom and necessity, is demonstrated by the fact that it has been acted upon in England for nearly 200 years, and has been so nearly universally adopted in this country, and that nobody thinks of repealing it. We all know, too, how careful most men are to have their contracts written and signed, even when this statute does not require it. For example, most men, if they have money due them of no larger amount than $5 or $10, are careful to take note for it. If they buy even a small bill of goods, paying for it at the time of delivery, they take a receipted bill for it. If they pay a small balance of a book account or any other small debt previously contracted, they take a written receipt for it. Furthermore, the law everywhere, probably, in our country, as well as in England, requires that a large class of contracts, such as wills, deeds, etc., shall not only be written and signed, but also sealed, witnessed, and acknowledged. And, in the case of married women conveying their rights in real estate, the law in many states requires that the women shall be examined separate and apart from their husbands, and declare that they sign their contracts free of any fear or compulsion of their husbands. Such are some of the precautions which the laws require, and which individuals, from motives of common prudence, even in cases not required by law, take to put their contracts in writing and have them signed, and to guard against all uncertainties and controversies in regard to their meaning and validity. And yet, we have what purports or professes, or is claimed, to be a contract, the Constitution, made 80 years ago by men who are all now dead, and who never had any power to bind us, but which, it is claimed, has nevertheless bound 3 generations of men, consisting of many millions, and which, it is claimed, will be binding upon all the millions that are to come, but which nobody ever signed, sealed, delivered, witnessed, or acknowledged, and which few persons, compared with the whole number that are claimed to be bound by it, have ever read or even seen or ever will read or see, and of those who ever have read it or ever will read it, scarcely any 2, perhaps no 2, have ever agreed or ever will agree as to what it means. Moreover, this supposed contract, which would not be received in any court of justice sitting under its authority, if offered to prove a debt of $5, owing by one man to another, is one by which, as it is generally interpreted by those who pretend to administer it, all men, women, and children throughout the country and through all time surrender not only all their property. Hold on, I'm starting this over. It's so good. Moreover, this supposed contract, which would not be received in any court of justice sitting under its authority, if offered to prove a debt of $5, owing by one man to another, is one by which, as it is generally interpreted by those who pretend to administer it, all men, women, and children throughout the country and throughout all time surrender not only all their property, but also their liberties, and even lives, into the hands of men who by this supposed contract are expressly made wholly irresponsible for their disposal of them. And we are so insane, or so wicked, as to destroy property and lives without limit in fighting to compel men to fulfill a supposed contract which, inasmuch as it has never been signed by anybody, is on general principles of law and reason, such principles as we are all governed by in regard to other contracts, the merest waste paper, binding upon nobody, fit only to be thrown into the fire, or, if preserved, preserved only to serve as a witness and a warning of the folly and wickedness of mankind. Whew. Should we do one more? One more part? Or should we save it for next time? All right, I'll do one more. Make this the last one. Part 6. It is no exaggeration, but a literal truth, to say that by the Constitution, not as I interpret it, but as it is interpreted by those who pretend to administer it, the properties, liberties, and lives of the entire people of the United States are surrendered unreservedly into the hands of men who, it is provided by the Constitution itself, shall never be questioned as to any disposal they make of them. Thus, the Constitution, Article 1, Section 6, provides that, quote, for any speech or debate or vote in either house, they, the senators and representatives, shall not be questioned in any other place, end quote. The whole law-making power is given to these senators and representatives when acting by a 2/3 vote, and this provision protects them from all responsibility for the laws they make. The Constitution also enables them to secure the execution of all their laws by giving them power to withhold the salaries of and to impeach and remove all judicial and executive officers who refuse to execute them. Thus, the whole power of the government is in their hands, and they are made utterly irresponsible for the use they make of it. What is this but absolute irresponsible power? It is no answer to this view of the case to say that these men are under oath to use their power only within certain limits. For what care they, or what should they care for oaths or limits, when it is expressly provided by the Constitution itself that they shall never be questioned or held to any responsibility whatever for violating their oaths or transgressing those limits? Neither is it any answer to this view of the case to say that the particular individuals holding this power can be changed once in 2 or 6 years, for the power of each set of men is absolute during the term for which they hold it, and when they can hold it no longer, they are succeeded only by men whose power will be equally absolute and irresponsible. Neither is it any answer to this view of the case to say that the men holding this absolute irresponsible power must be men chosen by the people or portions of them to hold it. A man is none the less a slave because he is allowed to choose a new master once in a term of years. Neither are people any the less slaves because permitted periodically to choose new masters. What makes them slaves is the fact that they are now and are always hereafter to be in the hands of men whose power over them is and always is to be absolute and irresponsible. The right of absolute and irresponsible dominion is the right of property, and the right of property is the right of absolute irresponsible dominion. The two are identical, the one necessarily implying the other. Neither can exist without the other. If, therefore, Congress have that absolute and irresponsible law-making power which the Constitution, according to their interpretation of it, gives them, it can only be because they own us as property. If they own us as property, they are our masters, and their will is our law. If they do not own us as property, they are not our masters, and their will as such is of no authority over us. But these men who claim and exercise this absolute and irresponsible dominion over us dare not be consistent, and claim either to be our masters or to own us as property. They say they are only our servants, agents, attorneys, and representatives. But this declaration involves an absurdity, a contradiction. No man can be my servant, agent, attorney, or representative and be, at the same time, uncontrollable by me and irresponsible to me for his acts. It is of no importance that I appointed him and put all power in his hands if I made him uncontrollable by me and irresponsible to me. He is no longer my servant, agent, attorney, or representative. If I gave him absolute, irresponsible power over my property, I gave him the property. If I gave him absolute, irresponsible power over myself, I made him my master and gave myself to him as a slave. And it is of no importance whether I call him master or servant, agent or owner. The only question is, what power did I put into his hands? Was it an absolute and irresponsible one, or a limited and responsible one? For still another reason they are neither our servants, agents, attorneys, nor representatives, and that reason is that we do not make ourselves responsible for their acts. If a man is my servant, agent, or attorney, I necessarily make myself responsible for all his acts done within the limits of the power I have entrusted to him. If I have entrusted him as my agent with either absolute power, or any power at all over the persons or properties of other men than myself, I thereby necessarily make myself responsible to those other persons for any injuries he may do them, so long as he acts within the limits of the power I have granted him. But no individual who may be injured in his person or property by acts of Congress can come to the individual electors and hold them responsible for these acts of their so-called agents or representatives. This fact proves that these pretended agents of the people, of everybody, are really the agents of nobody. If, then, nobody is individually responsible for the acts of Congress, the members of Congress are nobody's agents. And if they are nobody's agents, they are themselves individually responsible for their own acts, and for the acts of all whom they employ. And the authority they are exercising is simply their own individual authority, and by the law of nature, the highest of all laws, anybody injured by their acts, anybody who is deprived by them of his property or his liberty, has the same right to hold them individually responsible that he has to hold any other trespasser individually responsible. He has the same right to resist them and their agents that he has to resist any other trespassers. Whew. we will pick up with part 7 next time. Ah, so good. All right, guys. Hope you're enjoying this. I am. All right. Thanks for hanging out in the chat. Another couple of reminders. Supporters get exclusive access to this animated background. You can get it on your computer. If you want to become a supporter, you can get this animated wallpaper that you see in this video. You can actually get it on your computer as your wallpaper. It's pretty cool. I give this animated background, and as well as most of our others, to the people that support the channel. You can support the channel at disenthrall.me/support. Also, because we're reading Spooner, I'll just remind people that I produced the full audiobook as an audiobook and not with my commentary and other digressions of Lysander Spooner's No Treason, and made it available for free on all of our platforms. So you can search this channel for it, or you can go to disenthrall.me/platforms and find all the places that we upload to and get that full actual sort of professional audiobook there. Yeah, I guess that's it, guys. Have a great day. I think our next show is going to be on Tuesday. We're going to have a special guest hosting with me, and we're going to have some good chats. I have a couple things. I'm probably going to talk about standards, why it's important to have them, what are they, standards for what constitutes apologies, what constitutes good or high or low quality feedback on your actions or your positions, and what good standards are for beliefs that you hold, things like that. That's going to be what I'm going to talk about on Tuesday. So with that said, I will see you guys later. Have a great day.